Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be discussing how to create content that is engaging, shareable, and delivers ROI. So I'm going to take care of a few housekeeping items first, and then we'll get into it. We're going to have a ton of resources for you on this webinar, and do not worry, we will make sure and email you all of those resources so that you have everything, including the recording of this webinar and the webinar slides. And yeah, if you have any questions, there is a question tab, so make sure you put them there, and we'll make sure and reserve some time at the end of the webinar to address those questions. And if we don't get to your question, if time is sort of limited, do not worry. Like I said, we will be in contact with you so that we can make sure and answer those questions for you if need be. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to try and move this to the next slide real quick. There we go. Okay, so we have Natalie with Influence & Co. and David Fortino with NetLine Corporation. I'm going to let you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves. So take it from here.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's really great to meet you. This is Natalie Stezovsky. I'm excited to chat through a multitude of different talking points today that relate to content creation and content strategy, and excited to be partnering with David and the team at NetLine to be presenting this for you as well.
Thanks, Natalie. I'll echo the sentiments. Yeah, from our side, we're excited to dig in a little bit about content syndication strategy as a follow-up to your content ideation points and nuggets that you'll be sharing. And then beyond that, we'll dig into a little bit around content consumption behavior as it relates to B2B buying and decision-making. And then ultimately, take that over to measuring ROI and some true kind of proof points is to support all of this kind of factual and data-driven presentations.
No, I think that sounds great, and we've kind of touched on some of these 6 points here that we're going to be talking about. So I think that'll be great to dive into. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of different areas of content creation strategy and that syndication part that, David, you're going to be covering that we're going to chat through. So as Natalie Slyman said at the beginning, there's going to be lots of resources for you that we're going to be able to follow up with, but feel free to ask us any questions. We're going to reserve some time at the end to chat through a little bit more about that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get things kickstarted, if that sounds good to you, David.
Sounds great.
Perfect. So I wanted to talk through a little bit about the 2018 State of Digital Media Report, which really was a report that showcased the current landscape of what editors at major media publications are looking for in their content and how they're measuring that success. So we looked at over 3 million different pieces of content, analyzed what content was working well, what content wasn't working well. We interviewed a lot of those different top editors at these publications to also understand what they're valuing. How are they seeing a piece of content as successful or not successful? And these are kind of the 3 main buckets that they were measuring content on. Obviously, at the end of the day, we want to be creating like shareable, engaging content that's going to be providing value to whomever that end reader is. And so about 69% of the editors that we spoke to are measuring it from a social share capacity, which is, how many, tweets or Facebook likes did this specific post have. But the majority is really coming from a page view perspective. So as you can see, 93% of the editors that we were talking through place a lot of value on page views. And then 75% are putting that emphasis on how long you're actually on the site, how long it's taking you to read through a specific article. So these stats will be provided to you as a follow-up, but it's a great basis for you to start building your content strategy and start to understand what a lot of the media world is looking for and how they're considering a piece of content successful. So this, again, it kind of leads into this how to create high quality content. And really it starts with that strategy, right? went a couple pages too far. And this is an area where we see actually a lot of brands and organizations failing. And they're doing that because they're wanting to just get content out the door so they can see pieces of content publishing, but there's no real alignment between the type of content they're producing and how that content is aligning back to their end goals. And so David, feel free to jump in on this, but this is really the first area that you need to focus on when you're thinking about, okay, how do I create content? What does this need to look at? You first obviously need to understand who you're talking to, what that audience persona is, and David, I know that you're going to probably get into this in a little bit as well, but understanding what your buyer's journey is with them, how many touch points you have, what their decision-making process is looking like on their back end to work with a partner like yourself or buy a product from you. And so I think that's really key, and it's also key to understand from that audience perspective, those psychographic and demographic items, but also where are they engaging with you online, and where are they at in terms of their organizational structure? Is it a director of marketing who then has to report to a CEO, or are you selling right into the C-suite? Those are two different messages. They're two different buyer's journeys, and so you really have to kind of think through what that specifically looks like as it relates to your audience. So David, did you have anything else that you wanted to add around developing that audience persona?
Yeah, those are all phenomenal comments and perspectives. It's something oddly we echo quite a bit, and I say oddly because of the fact that you would expect, being where we're at in the position in the marketplace, vendors come to us to execute their content marketing strategy as it relates to generating leads off of gated content. So the assumption would be that that content would have been created already, discreetly focused on reaching specific personas, understanding persona development and how different functional roles and or levels within even specific company sizes changes not only the paradigm of how those users engage with content, but the decision-making process and buyer's journey as well. A lot of times we're getting content that's written completely in a different voice, specifically targeting a different audience than their briefing might be for their actual campaign KPIs. And so taking that backwards, just two simple things I always advocate for anyone. Audience personas get thrown around a lot, or customer personas as well, as if just everyone knows what to do. And I think there's two ways to really dig in deeply and quickly there to better understand who you should be talking to and how you should craft your message. One would be actually talking with current customers, and perhaps even customers that didn't convert for you, and understand why. And then beyond that, don't underestimate the power of your sales team providing kind of in the trenches feedback of the pain points that they constantly are encountering. Marketing can't solve every problem without talking to sales.
Yep. No, I think that's absolutely right. I'm actually going to touch on that correlation between the marketing and the sales team here in a couple of minutes. And I think even one more thing to add on to that, as you mentioned a little bit more about tone, is understanding what channel you're producing the content on, and what tone and engagement you need to have on those specific channels. For instance, you're probably going to have a different tone if you're producing content on a platform like LinkedIn versus Twitter or Facebook or on your blog. And people interact with those channels a little bit differently as well. So there's a lot that kind of goes into that audience identification, but it really kind of sets the foundation for how you should be communicating with your audience, what they're going to find valuable, and some of those different parameters there. The next element is really mapping out your marketing goals. I say marketing and business related goals because content can really hit both. And so I think it's really figuring out, okay, what do you want this content to achieve at the end of the day? Is it lead generation? Okay, great. If that's it, let's make sure that we have created content that sits at every stage of that buyer's journey, which we'll talk about here in a second? Or is it really, you know, nobody knows about me. How do I get people to just know who I am? And that's a lot about, you know, staying consistent, staying top of mind, and really just being a resource for them, so that when they are ready to purchase, you've been providing them this valuable information in the format of, you know, digital content, and they trust you, and they're like, hey, this company's been providing, you know, valuable content. They're probably going to be a really great resource to talk about, you know, my business needs. And so I think that's a really great starting point as well, of just understanding, what do you want to accomplish? You know, 3 months down the road, what are your success metrics going to look like? 6 months down the road, what are they going to look like? And a year down the road, so you can understand, okay, what's our initial goal and what's the long-term goal, and how can our initial goal feed into that long-term goal specifically. And then a content timeline. So this is really looking at, okay, when do I want to start seeing these results, and when do I want to start producing content? You know, it's something where, depending on organizational size, you know, I think it's more about the quality of the content that you're creating versus the quantity, and working smarter with that versus harder. And so there's some organizations where, you know, they might produce 2 to 4 blog posts per month, but they have it in the content funnel and in the content journey, and making sure that every single piece of content is aligned. Whereas there are some other companies, and depending on your industry, where they're producing a piece of content every day. So that'll just really kind of determine, based on the goals that you want to accomplish, and based on the resources that you have, in order to create that, like, highly engaging content that is working towards a goal. And it's not just throwing content out there and saying, okay, hey, I published a piece of content, because that's where you're probably not going to see the results that you're looking for. And then the third area is a distribution strategy, which, David, you're also going to touch on here in a little bit as well. But you want to make sure that your content is getting seen. And so this needs to be a large part of your strategy as well, of not only creating like high quality content at a consistent rate, but how are the people that you're wanting to get in front of going to see this? So this could even come from, you know, if you're wanting to get content out in the media, how you can, you know, look at, how am I securing guest contributed articles, or how am I getting references to my organization in this media? It could even relate back to, you know, a paid amplification strategy, where we might be looking at, how can we put some paid ad spend behind a piece of content that we're creating on a platform like LinkedIn, where you can get highly targeted by role, by company size, and even by region that you're wanting to target as well. So those are kind of the 4 areas that you need to be looking at when you're developing a content strategy, and then really making sure that every piece of content that you're going to be creating is aligned. And I think that that's really vital as we think about building out what types of content are going to make sense. So this leads me into the what types of content you should be creating based on the stage that a potential buyer is with you. Whether they are top of the funnel, which is really going to be where you're raising that awareness, like guest contributed content or earned media, for instance, is definitely part of that top of the funnel. Its purpose is to educate consumers. It's to start to showcase like what problems are out in the industry and how you need to be making decisions. You're not necessarily selling your solution yet, but you're really starting to lay the framework for the problem that your organization can come in and support. Middle of the funnel of content is really that consideration phase. So this is where the content on your own site, such as a blog, is going to come into play. This mostly commonly manifests itself as your company's website content and your company's blog content. You want your earned media at the top of the funnel to lead people to your company's website or blog, where they can find out more about you, and they can start considering you as a partner. So something that you might think about is, okay, you know, if I'm creating a blog post, what's an earned piece of content that can relate to that blog post that I'm creating? And then the bottom of the funnel is the decision. So now that they have heard about you, they're starting to build trust with you of just, being a resource in this industry. Now you want to give them information of how you are the solution to whatever that problem is. And this is really where like gated content might come in and play, because this is also a perfect opportunity for you to be able to capture a lead's information. And this might be the call to action at the end of the blog post that we were creating at the middle of the funnel content stage. And so it's something where it's a little bit of a longer form piece of content. It's typically designed nicely, if you will, and it is kind of put behind a wall where somebody might have to enter in their email address or whatever those pertinent pieces of information are, and then again show you the capabilities of like, okay, here's the problem, here's how we are specifically that solution. And then I think even after that process, so say somebody has downloaded a piece of content from you, how do you stay kind of on their radar and consistently nurture and engage them? And this is where, for example, a drip email nurture campaign might really come into play. Maybe that's 6 to 8 emails after somebody has downloaded a white paper where you are, providing them more resources, you're staying top of mind, hopefully getting them on a call or engaging with your product or service in some type of capacity, whatever you want that call to action be, and going from there. So I think one of the really key elements in order for this funnel to work is making sure that every single stage is aligned with one another. So if at the end of the day you want leads and you want them to enter in their, information to download a piece of content, you need to make sure that your blog content supports whatever that downloaded piece is going to be. And then you need to make sure that your top of the funnel content, which might be your earned media, is supporting whatever's on the blog content, which is supporting, getting down to downloading that specific gated piece of content. So that's a little bit more about kind of the types of content that you should be creating on each stage of the funnel. Obviously, this can depend based on industry, based on your buyer persona, based on what you guys are currently creating. But those are kind of the 3 areas in terms of how you should be thinking about a customer journey, because it's something where at the top of the funnel, people typically aren't ready to buy yet, and so you need to kind of make that case and talk about maybe industry trends and stay top of mind with them. So when, again, that need arises, your organization is the first that they think of. David, did you have anything to add on to that at all? I know that was a lot, so wanted to make sure there wasn't anything that you wanted to input your 2 cents on.
No, I thought that was extremely thorough and well stated. As it relates to gated content, though, I've seen gated content used to support all stages of the funnel as well.
Yep.
So that's just something to consider, that it doesn't always have to be gated or non-gated, and when it is gated, it doesn't always need to automatically attach itself to being BOFU or bottom of funnel.
Yep, and I think it's just something where if like your goal is lead generation, you want to figure out what that lead magnet content is so you can capture that. We use at Influence & Co. a lot of times white papers as that, but white papers can absolutely be used and leveraged and not gated. So I think it just, when you're at that bottom of the funnel and you're at that decision-making process, you want to give them a place where they can engage with you further, and that you can engage with somebody who's actually, showing some type of interest in that capacity. Cool. Well, why don't we go into a little bit about, I know that we've talked through like zeroing in on your audience, which we touched a lot about at the beginning of the presentation, so I won't spend too much time on this. But again, in order to create high quality content that is going to move the needle, I can't press more on this of really zeroing in on your audience, creating those audience personas, identifying their needs, identifying questions or concerns, knowing their job titles and requirements, knowing what metrics they're being measured on as well. Again, a lot of that I think can come from, having conversations with your sales team of what conversations are you having with, potential clients? Are there, barriers that keep coming up on a consistent basis? Are there challenges that they are consistently facing? How do we create content that can really support and alleviate some of those barriers as well? So I think that'll be something really important for you guys to think about before you even get to the actual writing stage of developing a piece of content, zeroing in on that audience a little bit more. And this again goes to understanding as well how your potential lead or your potential client, what are their success metrics? So something that I have a lot of conversations with prospective leads that Influence & Co might be working with is, okay, hey, how do I support you the best? What are you getting measured on? Is it something where, your boss is going to measure how many leads you're getting in the door, what that website traffic looks like? Do they want just like point of view in the marketplace? Are they wanting to enhance their SEO? So really having those conversations around your audience of how they're being measured on can really help you put together a solution that's going to fit their specific needs as well. Cruising right along, wanted to also touch on the actual creation of content. I know that this can be a major pain point for a lot of organizations, and so hopefully after this, we can ease some of those concerns just a little bit more. But here at Influence & Co, whenever we're creating a piece of content, we kind of follow 4 rules, making sure that it's industry leading, it's data driven, it's educational, and it's amusing. I always like to say when you're developing a piece of content, put yourself in the reader's seat. What makes you excited to read an article? When you have read an article and you feel like, man, I got a lot of value out of that, what was the structure of that? So obviously when we're talking about industry leading, like make sure your ideas are innovative and new, not something you can find just anywhere from anyone else. You don't want to like rehash information that has been conveyed a million times before. And so this does take research, especially if you're in a competitive landscape, you want to make sure that you're coming in with a fresh new idea. This is also something that a lot of media publications are really looking for, is we don't want to cover something that has already been covered 10 times before. What difference are you bringing to the table? The second one is pretty self-explanatory, but data-driven. Obviously, if there are any stats or supporting research that you can include to back up any claims that you're making, obviously that makes for a much more credible piece within the eyes of the reader. And then the third area is educational. I also think that this is huge. Consumers are smart today. They know when they are being sold to. And so the whole goal with content is, again, helping educate them to make better decisions, and ideally look at you as a solution because you've been helping them make a better decision through their process. And so it's something that publications today, especially the media publications, they won't accept any content that is promotional. And so you really need to think about, okay, if I am sitting in the reader spot, what's going to be a valuable piece to me? What am I going to get out of it? How am I going to, learn something from this piece and apply it to my day-to-day business? And the fourth area is amusing. Again, a little bit self-explanatory, but you don't want it to be, a boring piece. You want it to catch the eye. You want it to catch their attention, and so you don't want to make it too terribly long. You want it to be fun. You want it to be a fun read. And so again, I think if you just really put yourself in the seat of a reader and develop content from that perspective, you're going to be much better off than if you were sitting, okay, hey, I'm writing this blog post because I want to get leads. Then you tend to make it more about you versus them, and they'll read through that and they won't engage with you as much as you would like. And so I know we're kind of getting into David's section here in a minute, but the other thing that I wanted to kind of talk through as well is what editors are looking for. Looks like it's not going to the next page. There we go. And really how to engage with media publications today, because I do think that it can be a valuable strategy when you're looking at the distribution of content, and also understanding, like, what is your audience reading? What publications are they reading? And how can I get into those specific publications on an ongoing basis to stay top of mind with them? And again, this is coming more so on like the top of the funnel content, that awareness stage. And so like we even have a quiz that talks a little bit about, okay, enter in your audience and we can actually spit out what types of publications that needs to look like as well. So for instance, you know, everybody's dream goal is to like get into a Forbes or an Inc. But is that really where your exact audience is reading? You know, is it something where if you're wanting to talk to, you know, a CTO or maybe somebody a little bit more technical in their field, are you really going to be able to kind of build that educational relationship with them by publishing there versus maybe a publication like CTO.com? And so those are definitely things to think about, especially when it comes to like a media distribution perspective of what that looks like as well, but also just staying up to date on, you know, trends that you might be seeing within those media publications because your audience is reading that. And so that's another area to kind of be thinking of. The other thing with working with media publications, let's see if it, oh, there we go, is how to pitch your content to them. Obviously, there is a vast majority of media publications, and I feel like this is maybe one of the biggest challenges or pain points that a lot of organizations have, is how do I pitch my content to online publications? I think one of the biggest areas that a lot of people fail at when they're pitching their content to online editors is they have that me mentality, where they're sending off a pitch to an editor saying, I think that you should write about me because of X, Y, and Z. Like, that is really not what editors are looking for. They really want to, you know, publish a piece of content that's going to get their audience more engaged with them, right? And so thinking about that when you're going through that pitching process. So like one of the things that I would encourage you guys to do is look at their guidelines, understand what type of content they're producing, who are they producing it from, what is their like consistency like, are there any themes? So you can really have a good grasp on what they're looking for, and then you can really tailor the pitch to what that editor is specifically looking like in the ideation phase of what you want them to be talking about. So this will be sent over in the follow-up as well, because we have a sample email that I'm going to share with you right after this slide of exactly what a pitch to an editor might look like. But there's kind of 5 elements of an effective email that we have seen when you're looking at pitching to editors. So obviously a descriptive subject line. With that, you kind of want to keep it like short and to the point as well, because editors are extremely busy and they're probably getting thousands of pitches every day. So how can you convey in that subject line that you have a valuable piece of content for them that's going to benefit their audience? Obviously, the human-to-human connection is really great. So if you can provide some type of friendly, personable introduction, maybe you've read something about them online that they're interested in, but any way to kind of make that personal element in the email as well. If there is an article summary that you have written, obviously include that, but really make sure that, again, you're coming at it from the you perspective of how this piece of content is going to benefit that end audience. And again, 4 is really kind of talking through that non-promotional side of things, because 79% of editors today say that the biggest problem with guest content is that it's too promotional. A lot of them don't care about the company that you're with. They, again, want to make sure that what they are talking about and what type of content they are providing to their readers is going to help them, educate them, and they're not going to read through and say, hey, this company is trying to sell me. And then the 5th is just like respecting the editor's schedule and preferences. 56% of editors set a full editorial calendar. Long editing queue is the biggest reason it takes to publish their guest contributed content. So really just figuring out like, how can I be a resource for them, and just being mindful of that. So on the next page, which you'll get in a follow-up so you can actually see the text here, if it'll go to the next slide here for a minute. is really how you can craft that email. So that'll be sent in the follow-up. But again, I think with content, and David, you can take over right after this, the biggest thing is putting yourself in the reader seat and figuring out, how do I create an effective piece of content that's going to provide them value at the end of the day, and it's aligning with everything else that you have going on from a marketing perspective or even a business perspective. So David, I'll kind of let you take it away from here and talk through more about like the distribution and the syndication side of things, because I think that relates really naturally, obviously, to the creation of the content and what that strategy looks like.
Absolutely. Thank you. Nicely
Yep.
done. Yeah, so in terms of syndication, I'm going to come at things with a little bit different perspective and kind of building upon a media strategy. But as it relates to really transitioning from an exposure and time spent and market footprint perspective to gated content and lead generation. And so as it relates to all of the elements that Natalie pulled together, it's really fundamental, right? That when you take into consideration that you're creating content, sure, media outreach is a huge portion of your efforts, as they should be. Using any organic channels that you have available to yourself, you should certainly be covering those bases as well. Beyond that, though, this notion that if you create content and you blog about it or you post it on social, you send it out in your newsletter, you've kind of concluded all of your bases, that's simply not true. The reality of it is, and this slide nicely kind of summarizes a lot of these attributes, is that the web, quite honestly, is increasingly cluttered. The notion that the struggle is real is something that we reinforce all of the time with our clients, because it doesn't necessarily matter that you've created the most compelling content or hit upon a really hot topic if no one actually sees it. And so this is where our organization comes into play. We really excel at delivering content specifically to in-market professionals as they're engaging and consuming content specific to their own business challenges, needs, and problems. And so what we'll do is we're going to jump ahead, and I'd like to expand upon Natalie's insights and dig a little bit deeper into actual content consumption behavior exhibited by those in-market professionals. We're going to do this by extracting some nuggets that are mostly detailed content consumption analysis of a report that we pulled together called the 2018 State of B2B Content Consumption and Demand Report. In summary, this report really took a look at millions of gated content requests, I believe just shy of 8 million leads over the past year, and looked at analyzing the landscape, understanding active audience research topics alongside with competitive landscape of marketers targeting specific personas, and trying to decipher, quite honestly, how professionals are consuming content, the types of content, where they stand inside an organization, the level, the job area, the job function, the size of that company, and try to distill all of that data into actionable insights that marketers can leverage on future campaign executions. And so, as Natalie reinforced earlier, the demand for content to feed the needs of professionals, but not just professionals, consumers as well, is increasingly rising. The web is increasingly more and more cluttered. This clearly presents a big opportunity, but also a challenge. The challenge is obvious, is that how are you going to try to break through some of this clutter, speak to discreetly the specific personas that you're trying to capture attention from, and those that you're not trying to capture attention from, how do you position your content so that it doesn't necessarily attract those? And so what we started looking at was, being that this was the case, that the content is quite honestly littering the landscape, we started looking into consumption behaviors at a functional level with inside organizations. And there were a few commonalities that have occurred that are quite honestly a bit eye-opening, but also common sense kind of plays a role here. So as we dig through, I think some of you will just be nodding your head. Content consumption activity by job level clearly reports that individual contributors, so those tend to be folks who are major contributors inside a company, but carry not necessarily management level role, i.e. managing people, as the most active grouping of professionals, ultimately generating nearly 30% of all content consumption. So again, we're kind of bringing that back to close to 8 million leads, 30% of which were from individual contributors. The next largest group were mid-level professionals, driving the next largest activity group, which were managers and directors. And then this is the part that every client doesn't want to hear, is that senior level leadership accounted for less than 15% of all consumption volume. And probably the biggest one to focus on is C-suite, C-level, actually downloading only less than 5% of all gated content on the platform. We'll advance the slide here real quick, make sure it's moving. And the one thing, as I'm waiting for my slide to move, the one thing to consider here is that it's rather obvious that those findings really tend to compound themselves within larger organizations. Larger organization obviously has less likely senior leadership will be proactively searching, engaging, and consuming long-form content. It does also take into consideration the fact that these professionals are seemingly overwhelmed in most cases, and it's just quite honestly hard for them to spend the time to be out there on the web trying to find this amazing content that you've taken the time to write, and you've taken the time to do research, to develop personas. But in reality, that persona research really has to take into consideration the realities of the end user, the end recipient who's engaging with that content. Just because you want to speak with the C-suite because you think it's the path of least resistance to a purchase decision, quite honestly isn't true. And so one of the most obvious and talked about facts from the report was this data point that we've coined called the consumption gap. It was specifically talking about, I'm going to advance the slide here again, specifically talking about the time it takes for professionals to consume content. Let's go back. Consume content in between the time it takes them to actually read the content and when they ultimately downloaded it. On average, the C-suite takes 21% longer to consume that same exact content. Because of that, there simply needs to be more awareness to the follow-up strategy associated to content consumption, how you're actually resonating with that specific audience base. And again, we'll back this up to common sense and practical approach, is that the C-suite is simply entirely too busy to be researching and reading long-form content. So we're going to jump forward here and dive into measuring ROI. And one thing to consider is, even before jumping into this, I do want to kind of reinforce a point. When we're taking that notion and saying that the C-suite is very difficult to reach, and they theoretically account for a very small percentage of the leads that are ultimately consumed on a day-to-day basis, what are you supposed to do to counteract that? I suppose it's not all that helpful for me to say, yes, simply that's the case. Ultimately, you need to consider the individual contributor, allow them to deploy a marketing strategy within their organization that you are going to be dovetailing around the C-suite. Doing so ultimately forges an area and a level of influence within that company that there is a global or holistic perspective of what your content delivers, how it's speaking differently to the different levels inside that company, and the different personas, ultimately dovetailing nicely into that entire complete buyer's journey. Because at this point, it's 2018, in any company of significance, there are 0 decisions made in isolation, almost all of which tend to be collaborative, tend to be either through a multi-stage, multi-group, multifunctional role decision-making path. And because of that, your content needs to address everyone's pain points along the way until there is a buy-in consensus. So as smart marketers, we just really need to digest those market realities and weaponize those realities into facts that are actually driving real-world executables for all campaign performance, regardless of whether it's gated content, CPC, submitting content to media, whatever you're doing, please take those realities into consideration. So onwards to measuring ROI. All of these points and comments are moot if your content strategy doesn't drive, in the case of, from our perspective, true ROI. I mean, that's the purpose of lead gen, is to build a pipeline. So with those nuggets in hand, we're going to make the transition of looking into this from a real-world application and execution. I'd like to touch on how NetLine's client IT Pro TV yielded tremendous results by understanding their prior positions, deploying a campaign leveraging the market observations I've been talking about, and some of which even Natalie touched upon earlier, and executed a campaign that, quite honestly, we were ecstatic in seeing, but I think realistically, any vendor in the space would be ecstatic with that kind of ROI. And so they were at a point where IT Pro TV was a end-to-consumer business model where they were delivering a product focused direct to consumer, delivering IT training, video-based training online, and it was an individual sale each time. They realized that a B2B strategy was something that they wanted to partake on, and that was based on internal data points showing that there was organic B2B growth, and they simply wanted to accelerate that. They started taking a look around the landscape, understanding all the existing strategies that you would use. They started with media outreach. They then went to paid search and social amplification and so on. And then ultimately they found content syndication, which was NetLine. The key kind of perks for them to consider content syndication is that they were able to break away from the impression-based model of the past, which is historically, if you're buying media, you're either buying impressions or you're buying clicks, neither of which guarantee leads and or conversions or even data capture. On content syndication and lead gen, the risks are really zero. And so you're only paying on a converted lead that specifically meets the campaign criteria that you define as the client. The benefits are obvious, right? In that you define if you want to reach IT directors at companies of 500 employees and greater, located in the United States, with perhaps a sub-job area of network security, you can do that. That's all very viable and it's actionable and it's transparent. The beauty there is that it also allows for really discreetly and nicely mapped content to exact campaign executions versus when it's not a campaign that's run like this and it's display or CPC or CPM oriented, you're really targeting personas and not ultimately a person. The end byproduct of all lead gen campaigns is obviously to get to a person to foster a relationship with, an actual user, an individual, not a cookie. And so in this case, they were able to execute one of those campaigns. They yielded 3,500 leads in a month with no prior existing lead gen strategy in place to support that, which was insane. Ultimately, the key metric that they latched onto and has since been vocalized to us is that they yielded a 1,500% ROI in 5 months. That's tremendous. If you're looking to kind of look into the case study in a little bit more detail, we certainly have a lot more information to kind of provide some color around their struggles prior to executing this strategy, the implications of mid-campaign optimization, and ultimately how they've kind of continued on to refine that strategy and structure additional ROI efforts moving forward. So I'm going to advance this. If you do want to take a look at that in further detail, it's available on our site under the Our Customers section. Try to advance the slide here. Yeah, and lastly, part of this was obviously me pulling some data specific to the report that's being presented on the left-hand side of the screen. It's pretty robust. There's a ton of data in there. I believe it's around 25 pages or so. It covers everything about job level content consumption, job function, job area, industry, sub-industry, content narratives, content humanization, top trending kind of thematic ideas to approach B2B marketers and or decision makers. The one thing Natalie talked about briefly early on was the notion of creating content that was compelling and interesting and innovative and different and thought-provoking. The one thing that we've kind of consolidated that into is humanizing. And that just because you're trying to reach perhaps a buyer or a senior person at a very influential company within a very influential role does not mean that this person is not human, that they don't have humor, that they don't enjoy something that's maybe a little bit of a break from the norm of all of the nonsense that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. So please don't forget that. The other
I couldn't agree with you more.
I mean, more often than not, we have live at any given day about 8,000 assets from our clients running lead gen campaigns, the vast majority of which are good. There are a portion that are downright terrible because it is getting back to that fact where you talked about earlier, which is about it's all about them and never about the prospect and or the reader, which is terrible. Readers see through that. It's 2018. People are highly educated. They understand. And then the flip side is there's some that are exceptional and they go above and beyond, and I'm blown away, where you just want to reach out to the client, congratulate them on their creativity, and their campaign performance is always rewarded because of that. And so we get into that as well in this ebook on the side, on the right-hand side, that you can check out. And I'm a contributor on that, but there's a ton of amazing folks that have far more impressive pedigrees than I welcome everybody to check out too. So Natalie, I think you're up next with some additional resources of your own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, going back to the humanization of content, I think a lot of times when you're in a marketing type of role, there are blinkers on where we forget that we are actually interacting with other humans, and that behind a company, it's people that run it. And so really trying to figure out how you connect with them on that level, I think, is really key. And so, I mean, that's something where that should be looked at across every type of marketing activity that you have, especially content. I think that is one of the best ways to really humanize the conversation between the two of you and really start to share like some of those insights that like your team has. And like, it's totally fine to have personality and share personal experiences in the content that you create, because that's how they resonate. And so I would totally just kind of like take a back seat and just, again, remember exactly, David, what you were saying is that you are wanting to talk to other people, and the company it's made up of people. So just kind of remembering that. I know that sounds fairly straightforward, but I think when we get in marketing mode, sometimes we put blinkers on and forget about that. But I love your resources. Obviously, our State of Digital Media white paper, I think, will align nicely with that as well. And that's just really kind of a current screenshot of especially what's going on the earned media side, and what a lot of these editors at major media publications are looking for, and some of the trends that we started to see on those pieces of content that we've been evaluating. So feel free to look at that. We also have a distribution white paper, which will be great to just start thinking through where all of the different places that I can put this piece of content that gets in front of my audience. And then we also have a content strategy checklist, which would be great to start with, as it will just kind of help you start to think through, have I included this, these specific elements in the strategy so that I can create effective content to establish my goals. So another thing too is we're offering a $500 off of your first month if anybody listening to this webinar signs up with us before November 23rd. So if that's something where you're like, hey, I need support on content, feel free to give us a shout. But those three areas of resources, I think, can really start to just help paint the picture of what you need to be looking at and what types of resources you need to be thinking about to execute on this efficiently.
That's great.
Well, thanks, guys. That was wonderful. So I think now's the portion where we get to some of these questions. And I just want to reiterate again, if we don't get to your question, no worries. You will have ample time to reach out to us and ask us any specifics. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So you guys, Natalie and David, feel free to tag team these, whatever you'd like. I think this first question might be pertaining to Natalie's section of the presentation. Natalie, can you give an example of content that's top of funnel?
Yeah, so top of the funnel content is, again, really the place where you are building that awareness and setting the framework for the problem or the challenge or the trend that's currently going on. Some examples that we work on with our clients when they're wanting top of the funnel content is that earned media. So that might be, a guest contributed bylined opportunity coming from our clients where they're talking about, a specific subject that we are then, placing in a media publication that reaches their target audience. And again, that's really where you're getting in front of them for the first time, and you're starting to frame the problem or the trend that's going on. So that's an example of top of the funnel content. Obviously, there's some other areas there, but that's an example. So David, I don't know if there's anything that you have to add to that.
I would say the one thing that we've observed as it relates to top of funnel content on the lead gen front would be that content that seemingly does introduce a lot of personality and or listicle type stuff, things like that, it does tend to attract a more, I would say, early stage prospect where they're in learning mode. They're simply trying to better understand the landscape.
Yep.
And that's okay, but you just need to understand that as a marketer, that if you go with content that's incredibly playful or very, very simple, that it's probably going to attract someone of that mindset as well. It doesn't mean that they won't advance, and it doesn't mean that their change in the buyer's journey might not happen because of your content, but you need to have set your own expectations that align with the type of content that you've created. If you created the top 10 things you need to know about, I don't know, a CRM system, and expecting those leads to immediately convert in a pipeline, that's not likely. And
Yep.
So I think you could sprinkle that very idea across every landscape and industry. It's just about ideation matching expectations.
Yep, I completely agree. And I think that's just when you are creating a piece of content, understanding and having those realistic expectations of the purpose of that specific piece of content.
Great, thanks guys. Okay, the next question. This is pertaining to blog length. This person was just wondering if there is maybe a length considered too long for a blog. I'm going to jump in real quick just because I help manage the blog at Influence & Co. And honestly, a blog is great because it's owned media, so you can really make it the length that you want to make it. If you're making pretty lengthy blog posts and you're noticing that people aren't reading them fully or they're dropping off, maybe try making them a little shorter. Just sort of test it out and see what works for you. But at Influence & Co., we tend to keep our blog post anywhere from 800 to 900 words for a typical blog post. If we're doing a longer form blog post for maybe a broader topic that is going to serve as like a pillar piece on our blog, those tend to be around 12 to 1300 words. So I just wanted to chime in on that one, but Natalie, David, if you guys have anything to add to that, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely depends on the type of topic that you're talking about as well, and the audience that you're wanting to read it. Obviously, if you're talking to, a CEO, he's probably not going to take more than like 5 to 10 minutes to skim through a blog post. So you just need to kind of keep that in mind when you are creating those. And again, kind of following that, like those four rules from the idea page that I was talking about as well, is like, you don't want to keep going on and going on and going on. You do want to get to the point of setting up the problem, talking through how they can think about that problem, and thinking about what those next steps are. So it is something where, it really depends. But yeah, Natalie, I agree with kind of what we've done on our strategy as well. But again, we talk to individuals primarily in like the marketing space. So typically they tend to engage a little bit further with content than maybe a CEO or somebody on the C-suite team.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that due to some of Google's recent changes in terms of ranking again, and who knows how long this will stay in play, but for the moment, I've read a lot about them favoring longer form blog posts for obvious reasons, that it looks like you have greater integrity and knowledge to share versus if they're short, their perception from an algorithmic perspective is that you may not be an authority on that topic. That certainly is just an algorithmic perspective, but something to consider. I believe what I've heard around Google specifically and their reviewing of blog posts as it relates to ranking is around 2,000 words. So something to consider. It's not end all be all, but it's certainly a guideline.
Great. Okay, next question. Do you separate content strategy development from overall marketing strategy? If so, who develops content strategy and who develops overall marketing branding strategy?
Great question. I'll take a stab at it first, and then David, you can follow up with it. I think in order to have a successful content strategy, you need to understand what those overall marketing goals are. So I think that it would probably be smart to start with just mapping out, like, what do you want to accomplish? Because content specifically is a piece of that puzzle. It's a tool in your toolkit. And so I think that you do need to like map out what those marketing goals are, map out what those business objectives are, and then put together a content plan that's going to support what you're trying to achieve from a marketing perspective. And this is even going back to understanding, like, as a department, as like a marketing department, for instance, what are the success metrics that you're specifically being evaluated on? And then how can we basically build a plan that can support that? In terms of who is handling that, it can differ from each organization. And David, you can probably attest to like what you guys do internally, but I do think that multiple individuals should obviously be clued in on the content strategy development, because it can hit and support so many departments within the marketing team and activities, but also outside of the marketing team as well. So I think that it's good to, like, we use content a lot of times for talent recruitment. So we talk a lot with our director of HR so that we can provide her valuable content so that we can get more qualified candidates in the pipeline, and that they've read content about us and understand who we are and our approach in the marketplace before we even hire them. And so, you know, we've talked with organizations as well that use content to help when they're looking to raise investments as a place to showcase their knowledge in the industry, and that they do truly know what they're doing as well. So there's been a couple areas there, but David, you can probably add on to that as well.
Yeah, so from the getting back to the question at a core, yeah, I'll completely echo your perspective that you shouldn't have a content marketing strategy without having an overall marketing strategy. Obviously, those two need to dovetail with one another's goals. With the marketing strategy defined, then you're able and in a position to execute a content strategy. In our case, our marketing strategy happens across the entire team. We're working with sales as well, and even our client services team, to ingest feedback from clients, both prospects that we've lost, prospects in play, and customers that we have in play. Beyond that, you know, I think we've taken our content marketing strategy and developed kind of 3 core pillars that we assign most content to. The first is more of a technical innovation perspective, and that creates a whole group of narratives. Next is customer centricity and allowing really our customer experiences to speak on our behalf in the marketplace. And then lastly is thought leadership. And part of that is like that report I had referenced earlier in the slides, which is explaining our position in the marketplace, but using data to do it, and the actual raw data that we've processed versus perhaps surveying, you know, maybe a few dozen of our clients. We're taking much more of a data-centric view based on just our position, and allowing that to kind of transition the findings into experience and thought leadership in the space.
Thanks, guys. Okay, so we have about a minute left. I'm going to try and get one more question in, and then we'll have to wrap up. One question we had here, let's see. How can we make content that appeals to C-level interests while keeping bandwidth in mind?
Good question. David, do you want to tackle this one and I'll support, or vice versa?
Yeah, I can take a stab. You know, the one thing is that keeping that perspective in mind, that they are incredibly busy, that they're incredibly challenged to even find time to let alone see your content. So I think you first need to take into consideration your syndication strategy in the first place. Is how are you going to get this content in front of that C-level or C-suite person? Assuming that you can do that efficiently and cost effectively. What's the core value prop, right? Well, we know that they're incredibly busy, they're incredibly taxed in time and bandwidth and so on. So the pain point you should be solving is that. And so if you're able to take a very complicated topic and distill that into an actionable, short consensus, and most importantly, position the content descriptively at the C-suite. So maybe it's like this, the CEO's guide on blank, whatever it might be. You're discreetly calling them into attention, that topic or headline or title of the asset will actually speak to that person versus it just being generic. And so when they see that, it could be written about the same topic, could have had all the same content, but the title alone could very much change perception for that person. Realistically, you're going to need to have that content be concise and extremely clear and actionable. If anything, I think some of the best content in that kind of executional model has been content that's provided the CEO with questions to ask of their own staff to say, yes, these are the things I should be considering as a CEO, but my team better have the answers for these questions as well. And so it's arming the CEO to kind of better understand how to make a decision on an informed basis without actually being out there vetting vendors and being in vendor meetings and all of that, because they just quite honestly don't have the bandwidth to do that.
I
Great.
100% agree.
Great. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Natalie and David, for an exciting discussion. And again, we will make sure that you have access to all these slides, the recording, and all these resources, including these links so that you can check out everything. Thanks again. This was really great. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.